we decided that we wanted to hire Ernst & Young to do a social return on investment study of the impacts of our work in housing stability and eviction prevention. And that's what we're here to talk to you about today. I just want to say, we didn't need Ernst & Young to tell us that the money that we invest, the time we invest, and the way we build relationships with residents to help them in those times where they have acute need that might otherwise destabilize their housing, we didn't need them to tell us that it was working. But we did think that by engaging a Big Four accounting firm, that we might see our own impacts in a different way. We might understand our role and cooperation with those of you in the room in a different way. And we might look at it as a bit of education. I've been using this analogy that, when you go to graduate school, you get a diploma, and most people hang it prominently on their wall. I don't have a graduate degree, so I don't know how that works, but I see them everywhere. But you don't pay for that piece of paper. You pay for the education that you went through in the process to obtain it. And that's kind of the way we approached the study with Ernst & Young. We really wanted to be stretched as an organization about how we think of our role and our success in this space. And we wanted to bring you all here today. I mean, admittedly, you are the choir. You are the folks that do work in this field alongside of us. You're the folks that fund us. And we wanted to bring you together with us today to think together about how we continually raise the visibility of housing stability and eviction prevention with those around us in the broader community. We have one quick example of this work that we're doing in Milwaukee now in this coalition building and community vision. And I just want to ask Jomar Hooper, who is our market leader in Milwaukee, to say just a couple sentences about what we're doing there as an example of collaborative action in this space.
Good morning, everyone. As Deidre mentioned, excuse me, I'm Jomar Hooper. I'm the Wisconsin market leader for CommonBond Communities. So how many of you in this room have read the book Evicted? So obviously you guys know that that book is directed and focusing on folks in Milwaukee. So how many of you guys would assume that Milwaukee was really going to get stuff together and try to get some community efforts to solve eviction after that book came out? You would be wrong if that was the case. So one of the things as we expand into Wisconsin to try to figure out our place and space in the market is that we want to be a thought leader in this work because of the great work that we do, as Deidre mentioned, in eviction. So we took it upon ourselves to kind of look at how we can be a part of the solution. We were fortunate enough to partner with the city of Milwaukee to get a grant to do some capacity building in the area around eviction prevention for the community. So we're leading a community-wide effort currently where we're bringing a group of stakeholders, pretty much everybody in the community who does eviction prevention work or is a stakeholder in this work, to kind of come to the table. We've had 4 or 5 sessions so far this year where we're actually identifying what the issue is. We're looking at the system. We're trying to come up with direct solutions and things that we can implement as a community to try to help us there. So we're trying to lead the way in that area in Milwaukee as well too, because we know that it's definitely an area where eviction is a top priority. So thank you.
So we want to show you a quick video that we put together. It's really intended to be a very palatable introduction of the importance of this issue for a broader audience. So we're going to show that, and then I'm going to turn it over to Jesse to start a conversation.
There we go.
name is Jessie Hendel, and I'm the Vice President of Advantage Services for CommonBond. Advantage Services is the area of CommonBond that provides direct resident services out in our communities in partnership with our property management team. So I've worked for CommonBond for 16 years. I started at CommonBond as an Advantage Services Coordinator at Cathedral Hill Homes in St. Paul. And when I started 16 years ago, eviction prevention was definitely a big part of my job, partnering with property management. And I've watched this area of our work continue to strengthen and evolve over my 16 years. So I'm just my job is to really tell you a little bit more in depth about this study that we did. And then we'll have plenty of time for questions and reaction. So this is our Advantage Services model. At the center of the work we do is work in the area of stability and independence, which is eviction prevention for CommonBond, as well as supporting seniors with independence. So eviction prevention is really the core of everything we do and supporting housing stability. If our residents can't stay stably housed, they can't go on and work on other area goals they might have in education advancement, health and wellness. So we really believe that first and foremost we want to support housing stability. This study focused just on our impact in this core. We really didn't look at these other programmatic areas. So who do we serve in our eviction prevention program at CommonBond, that center area of the pie? We serve about 450 people a year. That's of the, households a year. That's of the 6,000 households in our portfolio. The average household income of someone in eviction prevention is about $16,000 a year. That's lower than our average income across the portfolio of about $21,000. 70% are female-headed households, which definitely follows the data we know exists in the eviction prevention research about who's impacted by this issue. And 80% of people who are at risk of housing instability with us are due to financial issues as the presenting issue. So what did we want to achieve in this SRI analysis? We became, as Deidre said, interested in doing a social return on investment analysis a few years ago. And we'd seen examples, as all of you have, of other SROIs. And really thinking about our model, we thought that that core piece of our work in eviction prevention was really the place to start for us, that we know that that's the foundational piece, and that once someone has that in place, it can go on to other areas. We also realized that we couldn't see any examples of an SROI of eviction prevention programming within housing, so really felt that we could be a leader in this space to do an SROI ourselves, both helpful for us, but also for the industry. So as Deidre mentioned, we partnered with Ernst & Young on this analysis. We really wanted to better understand our role and impact in the space, analyze the short and long-term outcomes of our model, and understand and communicate the costs and benefits of our work. What was the process with Ernst & Young? Deidre mentioned it was as much about the learning we had, and I haven't gotten our diploma. We haven't gotten our diploma yet. Waiting on the diploma. Because it was a process of education and learning and some real deep dive into our own data and critical thinking among our team. So the first step was to identify who the stakeholders are in this work. We did a huge stakeholder map, and then really put together a theory of change, so a map of the short and long-term impacts of eviction prevention work for us. There was a lot of internal data digging. One of the data points was identifying what is CommonBond's investment in that center of the puzzle I showed you earlier. So what do we invest for eviction prevention? We came up with what CommonBond invests is just over $2.5 million annually in eviction prevention. What does that include? It's primarily staff time, both of our services staff as well as our property management team. Our property management model is definitely part of what we do to prevent evictions. So some work to identify our investment. The next step was Ernst & Young really did a heavy lift here in going away and looking at externally available data that could be used as a measure to help us both calculate and describe the impact of our model. So, the big punchline of what did we learn? When it comes to the impact of a stable home for CommonBond, SROI analysis estimates that for every dollar invested in CommonBond's eviction prevention, the community realizes a return of $4. We feel really, really good about this. As Deidre said, we've always known that this is new information that helps us really articulate the return on investment. What do these benefits to our communities include? Decreased use of homeless shelters, improved educational outcomes, lower healthcare costs. I'll give you some examples next. So what did the SROI analysis really measure? This is going back to when I said we did an impact map. So this is a list of all the impacts included in our SROI calculation. The first set of impacts, including improved access to quality housing, improved mental and physical social well-being, that first set of impacts were impacts we were able to actually include in the SROI calculation because CommonBond had internal data as well as external data that we could actually quantify for the SROI. This last set of two items, we didn't have internal data ourselves, but we know it's part of the theory of change. So we instead described our impact in this area. So it's not part of the calculation, impact on our increased self-agency and self-reliance, increased community well-being. So this is a list of all of the impacts that are articulated in the report and that go into the 1 to 4 return. So I'm just going to, for people who are really into the data here, I want to give you a little bit, and if you're not, it's okay to take a 1-minute brain break. But I just want to give you, for those of you who are really into the data, I want to tell you how this SROI worked. So this is one example of one of these impacts from before that was calculated. So what is the difference between the annual cost of healthcare for a person experiencing homelessness, $9,000, and the cost of healthcare for a housed person, $5,000? The difference is $4,000. So we took that $4,000 and then came up with we divided by 365. Then we multiply 365 times the prorated cost, but the average number of days, length of stay in a homeless shelter, 34 days. Then we come up with a prorated cost of the average stay of homelessness for a difference in healthcare. We then multiply that times 1.8, which is the average number of residents per CommonBond household. The next piece was an assumption we had to make, and we did test that in our sensitivity analysis, for those of you who are into that, but was the percentage of households that, if evicted, would actually become homeless at CommonBond. And after some discussions with we didn't have data on this, but after some discussions with our staff team, felt like that number took a conservative stance of 10%. So then we come up with this $22,000 in this particular area is what is saved in the area of healthcare. So this is an example of what's outlined in the report and how we get to our 1 to 4. Now, Ernst & Young really led us through the process to be conservative in their estimates and led us through a lot of SROI methodologies where you kind of discount the SROI to consider all sorts of factors. And one of those factors I'll just quickly point out is the duration of an outcome. So we've read a lot in the literature about the multi-generational impacts that eviction can have on households and families for generations to come. This analysis doesn't take that into account. It's really the duration that we take sort of credit for outcomes is CommonBond's average length of stay plus 6 months. So this isn't about multi-generational impacts of eviction. So I walked you through that. Oh, interesting. Okay. So you'll see, this is, I walked you through the calculation here. This is actually, looks like we got a duplicate slide where I more fully wrote out the calculation, which would have been much easier for me to talk you through. But there we go. So now we move to what do we want you to do with this? We really, in this SROI, articulate, what is the benefit to all of our communities of us mutually coming together and preventing eviction? What do we want you to do? We really are hoping there's not, I wish I could say sort of like Joe Mar's example in Milwaukee, that what we want you to do is come next Thursday for this community-wide effort. But really what we're asking today and hoping is that you'll create conversations in the circles you're in. Many of you are already in these conversations about how we can all support housing stability. There are a lot of great people doing great work in this space. I see some of them here, PPLs. My friend at PPL is sitting here with us. We want to continue to create conversations and think about action. What can we do as a community to prevent more evictions? What can we do as providers? What can we do in the public policy space to make eviction prevention and to change the landscape that people are experiencing eviction? So really to start, what we want to do with our time is really to have a conversation. To start us, there's a microphone somewhere, right? Am I using Deidre's microphone? We're going to ask Kathy Tenbrook to share just any thoughts as kind of working as a state director to prevent and long-term homelessness. Kind of what would you reflect on after what we've shared so far? Thank you. Yeah.
Good morning, everyone. It's nice to see everyone in this room. And there are folks in this room who've been working on homelessness as long, if not longer than I have. So lots of people could reflect, I think, on what this could mean for all of our collective work. But first of all, I just want to say thank you for doing this study. I think every time we have more proof that there's a return on investment in the work that we're doing, it is very helpful for all of us. So in terms of our, I know this room, our collective vision of creating housing stability for all Minnesotans, those of us who work directly on homelessness, recognize that homelessness is the most egregious form of housing instability. And really what ending homelessness means is that we prevent it from happening whenever we possibly can. And when we cannot do that, we make sure it is rare, it is brief, and that it only happens once. And so the work around preventing evictions, of course, falls into that definition in a couple of really important ways. Obviously, preventing it from happening in the first place is key. While there's not always a direct line from an eviction into homelessness, I think those of us who've worked on it for many years know that it's often the beginning of the downward spiral into homelessness if it hasn't immediately led there, because of unlawful detainers on records and all that goes along with the challenges then of ever being able to find that rental unit again. And then, of course, making sure that if somebody does become homeless and we're quickly able to resolve their homelessness, that they don't fall back into homelessness again. And once again, that's where preventing evictions comes in. So, in my many years in this world of work of homelessness, I think the things that have really struck me in this area of preventing evictions have been some of the really creative partnerships and ways that we have come together to do this work, whether it's agencies figuring out how to develop those relationships with landlords and prevent people from falling into homelessness because they have that one-on-one connection with a landlord, to public entities creating risk mitigation pools to work with landlords, to, of course, creative folks and minds like legal aid and others who really work directly with tenants. So there's much we can do. I only have 2 minutes, but so I think my main takeaway from this is a really important piece of our collective puzzle for creating a system that truly focuses on stability of all Minnesotans, including those with the very lowest incomes for whom housing is the most out of reach. My one last point, and Deidre was on the governor's task force on housing that was created and wrote this report, More Places to Call Home, Investing in Minnesota's Future. So if people don't know about this report or haven't really had a chance to read it yet, I encourage you to do so, because I think one of the things we can all do with this information is carry it forward into the next administration as we work with a new governor and a new administration to help them recognize what's in here. And a lot of what is in here is around eviction prevention. It's around increasing the flexibility of emergency resources to work with families and individuals to stay in their homes. It's around making sure that we don't have excessive evictions because of predatory practices. And so there's much we can carry forward, and I think this will help us do that. So thank you very much, Deepa.
I was really thrilled when I joined the governor's task force to see that the way the task force was set up was that there was a working group on housing stability and opportunity built into how we were looking at the work. And to me, that was an incredible starting place. I mean, it wasn't just about supply and demand, right? It was also about understanding the really human side of housing stressors and housing stability. Joe Bauer mentioned earlier the book Evicted, and for those of you who have read it, you're probably really familiar with a few of the concepts, and if you've ever seen Matt Desmond speak, he's a pretty powerful speaker on this subject. He makes a point that there's a real social justice and equity lens to our work around eviction. And we know that 60% of stressed household eviction candidates, if you will, are people of color. And he makes this analogy. He said that eviction is to African American women what incarceration is to African American men. And so as an organization that was founded from a social justice movement, that's a really important motivator in the work that we do, because we know that there are disparate impacts of these sorts of situations. We also know that kids really suffer. I mean, I talked about my own experience, which is just a really light touch, but we know that a kid that moves during high school has a 48% higher chance of dropping out of high school than a kid who stayed in place. So the impacts, the disproportionate impacts on kids and on certain communities within our greater community is really profound. Shannon Jones is with us here today and does great work in Hope Communities and was previously with NAS. And Shannon, I just wanted you to reflect on the work you've done in those two organizations and how you see housing stability and eviction prevention playing out in the communities you serve.
So I see, when I think about housing stability, one of the things I think about is what has made a strong community before around housing. And in light of the history and where we're at with the Fair Housing Act, it made me think of the GI Bill. And what the GI Bill did in terms of creating strong communities, strong schools, strong infrastructures for some people. And I think we're seeing it play out now when we've seen it bridge out into suburbia, and we watched how those communities grow. We watched how government supported that, subsidized that, and what happened in communities when they didn't have that all-encompassing thing. And now in Minnesota, we're leading in the gaps around education. We're leading in the gaps around job stability. We're leading in the gaps around home ownership. And I think that how I'm seeing it play out is now we're looking at communities saying, well, what's wrong with you? Pull yourself up. If you just work hard, you'll be able to get there. And that's not what it is. We are a result of a systemic issue that has privileged some and marginalized others. And so what I'm seeing in this work is people working really, really hard and not being able to make the gains. And that when you have that, the lack of housing stability, it messes everything up. I don't have an address to put on my application for a job. If I can't keep my phone on long enough because we're moving from here to here, or I lost my belongings from shelter to shelter because my stuff either got stolen, I had to move right away, I lose things. It costs a lot to be poor. All the application fees, all of those things. So what I'm seeing now is, I think we've watched this like slope of, we saw the encampment coming for those that are doing the work. We saw this coming before it got here. We were watching it. We're like, it's just a matter of time before you see more and more of this show up. People live in the communities that they want to, whether they have housing or not. And so as we're watching the decline, now we're finally, I think we've gotten people shook up enough that they're like, oh, now we really need to pay attention. And so I kind of led with the inequity of it, but it's definitely an inequity issue. Everybody deserves a place to stay. And to the great work that CommonBond is doing, we're able to see it actually is so much more cost effective if we just invest in people in place and give them the stability in the places that they're living in, that they have community in, that they have social networks in, and then they can continue to grow and thrive in those places.
Thanks. The work that everybody in this room is doing is really important. We want to open it up for conversation, other reflections you have on the issue generally, any questions you have on the work that we did with Ernst & Young, any ideas about how we can advance our work together, bring to a higher profile the work that we're already doing with a broader set of stakeholders. We'll just open the floor.
No one had a single question about the SRI today. I just find it so hard to believe. This is actually, is this on? No, I still This is actually about the data, and I like the narrative, the $1 invested has a return on $4. How much are you seeing that sort of a per person investment? I might have missed that sort of data point when you're saying, and we need to invest X amount per person for eviction prevention. Do you have that data point as well? And is that funding currently in the system and available to you or not right now?
We didn't actually look at it on a per person basis. We could. So we serve around 430 households at risk. I'm just thinking through this a little bit of housing instability in a year, and it costs us 2.5 some million. Those are cases. Katie says $5,000. $5,000 per housing risk. $5,000. We know that even as an organization, we save that much money by preventing a housing turn. So about $5,000. Is that money in the system for us? Well, it is because we pay for it, but it's scrappy. It's not. We fundraise. We fund it through the building operation. We ask private donors. We paste it together through all different sources. So there's not a eviction prevention fund that we're accessing. We're really piecing it together, and I'm sure Sarah is as well at PPL and others who do this eviction prevention work. So I think that's one of the things we really hope to see is that we continue to tell this story about how important eviction prevention is and figure out ways that we can create more opportunity to pay for it. So we really can't grow our services at the rate we might like to because funding is definitely a limiting factor. Yep.
Another piece that I have become aware of during this work is that we did a good attempt at separating out what is eviction prevention work or housing stability work from the rest of the work we do. And it was definitely art, not science. And so when we tried to make really good guesses about where we move from a general support for our household into eviction prevention. And so there's some, we've created a bright line there that doesn't actually exist. So overall, in Advantage Services, we spend about $4 million a year to do that work, right? And you could make the argument that a good share of that contributes to housing stability. We've decided to allocate a certain portion now.
And if I can just add just one quick point to it, and I know we're talking about dollars, in the 1 to 4 ratio, but it also is, it's not just the money, it is the philosophy and the expectation that we have and that we put on our housing and services teams, that housing stability is really our focus. And so it is about the investment, but it is also just about the philosophy and the way we conduct our business.
Hi, I'm Dr. Lewis. I work at the Center for Urban and Regional Affairs, and right now we're doing an in-depth study on evictions. We're focusing on 2 zip codes, as close to 50% of medical times evictions come from those areas. Thank you so much for saying that in the future. I appreciate you making that last comment. So my questions are twofold. You mentioned many times the eviction prevention model that we use. Could you describe what that model is? And the second part of the question, in addition to interviewing tenants, we also interview landlords. And I've had the opportunity to interview a number of nonprofit developers that are in those areas. I also had the opportunity to interview mostly private developers, some of whom are frequent filers in the city. And I think the point, or the kind of the cornerstone of the point your presentation made was the value of investing in these resources. But most landlords are not altruistic, as you would say some nonprofits are. So as you describe that model, what does that look like when we're dealing with a market that values money, not people? And in a sector, an area like North, where it's mostly single-family homes and duplexes, where a lot of private landlords are in the game, some of them are not even from the state. How does that translate? Or how do you see that work translating or impacting that class of owners?
Great. I'll take the first one and you help me with the second one. So our model, it's a lot of things. It's very holistic. It's not just services, it's also our property management approach. It includes early intervention with people, building trusting relationships, having high quality staff, reaching out, saying, hey, we see you haven't paid your rent, how can we work together to figure this out? It's having property management practices that allow payment plans. It's holistic. Early intervention is probably the piece, and proactive, persistent outreach are probably the primary things I believe in, and high quality staff that know somebody before there's a instability issue. It doesn't work to knock on someone's door and say, hi, you're being evicted, can I help? You need to know residents and have relationships long before there's any housing instability concerns. So early intervention, great staff, these are all important factors in our model. Great property management staff also I think is really critical and has been having a holistic approach of our housing and services team has been something that's been increasingly in our focus and effective for us. In terms of the private landlords, one of the curiosities I've had, and I'll let Deidre then add to it, but is what could work with private landlords? Could there be an eviction prevention model? What resources could we offer to the private landlord market? One conversation we've had in Milwaukee and some work that's happening in Milwaukee is there is some work on eviction prevention with people living out with smaller private landlords, where someone like our service coordinator is working side, is able to do outreach and offer eviction prevention services. We're talking in Milwaukee about that concept of could a service-enriched housing model ever work with private landlords? Could a CommonBond model ever work where we're reaching out and working with other smaller private landlords? So I'm curious if some model like this could work with a portion of the private landlord market if we had a tenant resource center that reached out to that market more.
I really appreciate the question about private landlords. It makes me think that we should not only do the social return on investment study, but we should do like the selfish return on investment study, right? Because we know that avoiding eviction is good business. Depending on who you ask, they'll tell you that an average turnover will cost you between $2,000 and $3,500. And so to the extent that you can prevent that, that is money in your pocket. It's lower staffing burden, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a story to be told there that may resonate with a different audience. However, I just want to say, if you're dealing with folks that are the frequent filers, as you call them, some people's business practices, some people's values, I guess you're not going to convert a certain set of landlords, right? But I think there is a set of landlords, and it's really easy to paint with a broad brush for-profit landlords as being bad people, which is not at all true. So I know that and we've had conversations with our colleagues at MHA and folks that we know personally who are on the for-profit side of this business, and they get and would like to keep people housed when they can. So I think if we can provide them with a little bit more information about our findings and that selfish return on investment, that would be helpful. I also want to say that for small, non-professionalized landlords, which is actually a really significant portion of the affordable housing delivery system, right? These are, like I said, they're not professionals. They're not people who have a lot of capacity time-wise. There are people who probably work a full-time job in addition to being a landlord. There are people whose own personal financial situation is deeply tied to whether they collect rent in a month. And so to empathize with the situation they're in and try to help them get over their own barriers to showing flexibility is really important. And then the final thing I'll say is that a limitation to providing a service that intervenes at the point of a potential eviction between a private landlord and particularly a small-scale one and a tenant, I'm not saying it won't work, and I'm very interested in thinking about it, but we've missed the opportunity to work in the context of a relationship. Because part of why we can be successful is that the relationship that our residents have with us is not fear-based, it's not compliance-based, although we do a lot of compliance. It's people come in as residents understanding that this living situation is intended to be positive for them. That we want to help them not only maintain stable housing, but accomplish everything else they want to do in their life. And that's a really different just tenor of relationship. And so if you go into a more traditional relationship tenant environment where you now have the potential of an eviction, the idea of having the trust of that resident, if you don't establish that up front, I don't think it would be as successful. So we have to think about how could you establish that up front. When you sign your lease, maybe it's an addendum that says, we participate in the friendly landlord group. And if you're having a problem, tell us, because we'll hook you up with somebody who will help you through it. I'm just brainstorming.
To the point of continuing the idea, the conversation around private landlords and the relationship to the cost savings. I wonder if you could guess or speculate on the 1-for-4 savings that you have or framing to the private market, whether that number would likely hold. Is it the presence of the service team that allows you to get that, or is it simply the isolated housing stability services that you provide, and so therefore it would hold in the private market? You understand my question? Is it the same number?
I think I do. So this study isn't looking at whether what we do is the most efficient or effective way to avoid evictions or negative exits. It's just looking at if we don't succeed, what are the costs, right? So what are the costs we're saving others, all of us, by doing this work, investing this time and money. So I think, therefore, that saving should be the same regardless, because it's the consequence of that outcome that we're studying, not, the number would be different, but those savings would be the same. So if you could do it and invest less, then you might have a 1-to-5. I just want to point out, I love having this shorthand to say 1-to-4. The number could be 1-to-7, right? We could have made a bunch of different decisions about attribution and the like that would have changed that number. So it's really more of an intellectual device to get people to understand this than it is a number that we want to, we could go through, and Jesse showed you the example, we could go through and defend every decision we made, every attribution level, et cetera, And you would find, if you did that we took the conservative answer in all cases. We were really trying to give, in effect, the worst case scenario of the great benefits to the rest of us. Does that kind of answer your question?
I just reiterate too that there is really data though on what is the, what did you call it, the selfish return on investment of $2,000 to $5,000 per negative turn saved. And so the more we can, I think, especially with private landlords, talk about that.
So, hi, I'm Gretchen Nichols from LISC. I too appreciate the intentionality of trying to articulate the values and benefits. I think ultimately it just boils down to, do we care? And how do we help people learn to care? And maybe it's through a profit margin, maybe it's through other ways, but I'm also channeling Roberto de la Riva with Inquilitos, who would take another approach, which is to organize and to help people take back their power and work to call the landlords to the table on an equal basis of power. So I'm kind of two minds here as to what, where we need to really lean in on, because there's this obvious power dynamic of who's in control. So I just wanted to throw that into the conversation because I think we shouldn't ignore the ability to empower renters in these situations and find their own strength in mass organizing. So.
Hi, I'm Katie. I work for CommonBond, and I'm thinking from a community perspective, to the point about power and about systems. I'm thinking about how much of our work as service coordinators and property managers requires us to have knowledge of where the resources are. Here's how you apply for emergency assistance. Go to St. Paul Foundation. Get in touch with this church group. And so how that knowledge, the power, is held by employees, and it's really difficult for residents and citizens to access those resources on their own, to keep track of it, to be believed, to get access to those resources. And so we've built a model based on this really hard to navigate system of community resources, and as a community we can change that. So we could make those resources more accessible, which would make it easier for private landlords and renters to resolve those financial crises without the support of a paid professional. So we could spend that money differently. I know that's weird to say as a nonprofit and a supervisor who has great staff, but that money can be invested in a different order.
Sure. I'm Carlene Rhodes, Vice Chair of the Board at CommonBond, and I'd love to get some feedback from you, all of you, because this is the choir, as Deidre said. Where should this go next? Where do we get the social return on the social return study? Who needs to know this? I think about what Art Rolnick did for early childhood, being a champion. And frankly, his strength was because he was outside the field. And not that we need a champion necessarily outside the field, but who's going to carry this message and maybe similar messages, buttressed by activists out there making noise too, but who can really affect change, whether it's at the state level or through greater philanthropy or whatever. But I'd just be curious, where you think we should take this? Obviously to you, but who else needs to know about this? Where would it actually matter? Who could do something about it? So please give Deidre your thoughts, or if you have some now. Looks like Lee has an answer.
Well, I just want to thank you. Good to see you. I have been reflecting a lot on housing narratives, and the shift in this to housing stability, I think, is really important, because the housing field has been about units, the capital to build units. For a very long time, that's how the field was really built. And I think this moves us to people in a way that's could be very effective. So broadening our message, I think, is really critical. When I look at most housing advocacy, and this is going to sound really weird, it starts with housing, right? And that makes sense, we're housers. But at the same time, when we think about where citizens' values are, it's healthcare, it's education. There's a whole lot of benefits from housing that accumulate in other worlds and other sectors. And those are the sectors that I think we need, thinking about broadening message, to bring into understanding the relationship between housing stability and the outcomes that people receive. So one of the things that related to the Minnesota Task Force on Housing we're trying to do is create sort of a different place, a different space to bring in others. And it's called Prosperity's Front Door. And it is a platform that we hope can help to translate to other worlds the importance of housing. And so even thinking of our tagline, housing, it's like Prosperity's Front Door. How housing does X, Y, Z in neighborhoods or families. It's like, even that, I mean, you know, healthcare and all of those things are really important, but we need to sort of reach out. And I think these sorts of studies, especially getting like Ernst & Young, right, are very helpful because it communicates with a different audience in a different way. So I'm really appreciative of the research and think that we should share, build. So one of the things you can do right now is go to Prosperity's Front Door. Like it, share it, add stories to it. I mean, I've already sort of tried to make that link with this study being highlighted on that website. So those are the sort of things that right now we need to do, but if we're gonna change the narrative, I think what we really need to have are more citizens entering the conversation where they're starting and bringing the narrative up from the bottom up so that they're thinking housing stability first.
Yeah, I just had a quick reaction, Lee, to what you said, that I think it's our strategic plan 2 to 3 years ago, the board really pushed on saying, we don't want to care about units, how many units, and translated it to number of people served. And so, I mean, it's a subtle, maybe not subtle, it's an important manifestation of what you're saying, that let's quit talking about housing as much as people served. And who are they? I mean, I'm always stunned by the percentage of people, residents, working 1 or 2 jobs. I mean, I think there are perceptions out there that people in affordable housing aren't working. They're on the dole. No, these people are working as hard as they can. So, but the people versus units, I felt was an important shift for us.
Good morning. I'm Mikkel Beckerman. I'm in the new housing stability area at Hennepin County. And 2 questions, I guess. One is, has the work that you've done led you to any legislative or policy reform thoughts? You know, pay or quit legislation or anything else we can think of? And are we having those conversations as folks? And where do we go with that? We do have a statewide Homes for All campaign that tends, in my opinion, to be more of a brick and mortar capital funding process. The homeless sector seems very well organized. But in the affordable housing arena, are we having those conversations and proposing things? I think landlords are well represented at the state legislature. I don't know how well the nonprofit housing sector is represented. Maybe something we want to discuss further. And then I guess, in my mind, you know, the struggles are across the arena in 3 main areas. It's access to housing that's affordable. How can people get into the housing? And there's a lot of work we can do around that. And then once people are in, how do we keep people stably housed? And then how do we help people as they transition? For people with very low incomes, a 2-month stint in treatment means they have to give up their apartment and they're homeless and they have nowhere to go when it's done, or an inpatient hospitalization for a mental health crisis, or as people transition. So those 3 areas in my mind are really key to where we need to be focused. And there's work to be done across the board in all those areas. And the more we gather and can organize ourselves on those 3 areas, the more movement and systems change we'll see. I'm curious to know the relationship piece. Have you thought about what a relational support for people in their housing would look like if you didn't own or control the housing? It's wonderful that you're able to afford to be able to have the Advantage Centers and to have people who are paid to be present in a building and provide relational support. But what does that look like in a neighborhood or a community? We say that housing is the essential platform for life. That's how we describe it. And housing is everybody's business. So whether you're a social worker at the grade school, or a park and rec worker, or a confirmation leader, or whatever in the neighborhood, how do we get everybody invested in trying to help support housing stability work, and what would that look like? And how would we train a community to gather around housing stability?
You just put a lot on the table at 10:01, which is great. But I just want to recognize that we did tell people we'd be out at 10. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just take a quick stab at some of the things you talked about, and then recognize that this is just, not the start of good conversations, but a continuation of a lot of good work that we're trying to do together. So the first question about kind of specific policy reforms that have to do directly with housing stability and particularly eviction. The Housing Task Force does have this whole section in the recommendations on that came out of the Stability and Opportunity Focus. I will just say, having been a participant in that process, that there were, as much as came forth in some of those recommendations, there were a lot more very specific, granular recommendations that were made by advocates in the field who know how these systems work much better than most of us that sat on the task force. And those are chronicled in an addendum to the report. And it sounds like mind-numbingly boring, but please go to that addendum, because there's a lot of really good ideas there that didn't bubble up to the top, 6 critical areas and 30 recommendations. I really appreciate your reflections on these different kind of stages of housing potential instability and where we need to potentially react differently, whether it's creating access, whether it's maintaining, and whether it's dealing with these transition times. And the one thing that made me think about, we were having a conversation yesterday with a potential funder and board member, and I realized in conversation with her that she was assuming that we know when someone walks in whether they're going to be a candidate for housing instability. She's like, what do you do for these households? And I'm like, wait a second. Like, these households are any household. Any one of us could face housing instability if you had a major health event, right? And if you're a low or moderate income household, a much smaller event can really put you in that tailspin. And so I think that's important to recognize. And then the final thing is this idea of how do you work to create relationships and support systems outside of a formal relationship and control of the real estate. And I'll admit that our basic focus at CommonBond is where we control the real estate, because speaking of power, that control is super important. We get to make a whole variety of different decisions because we control the real estate. So as much as I shift to let's care about the people, and I do, I know that a major lever we have in control is the power of the ownership of that real estate. However, we do work with folks like, we're going to take over some of Hope Community's property management. We work with other organizations to provide services outside of properties we own. And we do that really only in relationship with those power holders when we know we share those values. So it can be done. My previous comments were really about just understanding how important those personal relationships are to having people feel comfortable to use us as a support system. And then the final thing is another piece of work that we do, and PPL does, many organizations do, is really to talk about community engagement and cohesion. And so we don't have to be the support system for a resident. One of the things that we try to do is make sure that residents can count on one another, that residents repair relationships with families, that it's this network and fabric of social support. It doesn't have to be professionally administered. So I really appreciate all those reflections, and would love to talk further. Love to talk with all of you further. Please do as Eric said, and go to Prosperity's front door. Please watch Minnesota Housing Partnerships updates, Homes for All. Please help us share. This study is a slice in time of CommonBond's experience, and I would hate for it to be extrapolated too widely. But I think, again, as like an intellectual concept piece, it may help us reach some slightly larger circles than we currently do. So please feel free to do what's suggested on this card and help us get that return of every one of you telling 4 people about the importance of this work. And we'll be here next to you working on this in the future. Thanks for coming this morning.